Hello and welcome to this video in which we are going to talk about the crash of the Paris-Cairo flight, the MS-804 flight of the EGYPTAIR company, which took place on May 18, 2016, and for which a final report has finally been published by Egypt. The hypotheses have evolved a lot over time since the scenario of a bomb on board, a technical deference or a fire have been successively mentioned, and this report, which was highly anticipated since it was supposed to bring the definitive answers, except that this final report contains a number of inconsistencies which are openly decried and challenged by the French Investigation and Analysis Bureau. So, we come back to our accident on this plane. The MS-804, it's a flight that is provided between Paris and Cairo by the airline EGYPTAIR. We take off on May 18th, 2016 with an Airbus A320-200 with onboard 56 passengers as well as 10 crew members. It's a recent plane since it came out of the chains in 2003, but it's the fifth flight of the day for the device after having been to Asmara in Eritrea, having made a round trip to Tunisia before coming to Paris. This seemingly high flight pace is actually quite normal, as planes make round trips throughout the day. For example, the internal journeys between Paris and Toulouse or Nice can be up to 4 round trips per day. That is to say 8 flights over the day, so nothing abnormal here. The plane is going to take off at 23 hours 9 for a journey that should last about 4 hours, and after crossing Europe, where everything goes normally, it arrives above the Mediterranean. And so when it is about to leave Greek airspace, it is contacted by Greek air traffic controllers at 2 hours 26, but the aircraft does not respond, the pilots do not respond to the air traffic controllers, and the Airbus stops sharing its position at 2 hours 33. The disappearance of the aircraft, it is obviously confirmed by the Egyptian authorities during the night, and the Egyptian Ministry of Civil Aviation immediately says that the plane has undergone a terrorist attack, which simply means that there was a bomb that would have been placed on board the aircraft at Paris-Charles de Gaulle Airport, or else that a bomb was present in the past and it would not have been detected at the airport, but in any case it questions the safety at Parisian airports, and that obviously it makes a lot of media noise, and the information even becomes a real subject of dispute between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton at the time, who are then in presidential campaign, with these words that have remained famous from Donald Trump.
A plane got blown out of the sky. And if anybody thinks it wasn't blown out of the sky, you're 100% wrong, folks, okay?
And so, alongside this media buzz, we have information starting to appear, information that can be collected in open source, but also information that is revealed by the protagonists themselves, and notably the Greek Navy, who says we had a radar that followed this plane. It's a primary echo, meaning it's really the waves that bounce off the metal mass and come back to the radar. We're not on what we call the secondary, so there it's the transponder where the plane sends its information and that stopped transmitting. And what the Egyptians are saying is that the plane continued to fly for several minutes after it stopped transmitting, and this is obviously a behavior that is not compatible with the hypothesis of an explosion and destruction by an attack as suggested by the Egyptians. The next day, May 20th, there is a publication with messages that are sent by the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System of the aircraft. So, the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System is a communication system that allows the plane to receive information, clearances for air traffic control, updates on the weather, flight data that could come, for example, from the operations room of the airline, and the plane on its side will emit information, its position, diagnostic elements, and it's these diagnostic elements that are originally simply designed to allow the airline to prepare maintenance, to accelerate the realization of this maintenance, and so that the plane can leave more quickly. And these diagnostic information are the ones that were emitted by the plane and that were captured and therefore were shared on the internet. And there are 7 messages that are emitted between 2:26 and 2:29, and they indicate that smoke was detected at the front of the aircraft in the avionics bay, under the cockpit, as well as in the toilets. We also have sensor anomalies on the co-pilot's side windows. That is to say, on the right side. And that's why, at the time, one was already intervening regularly in the media on issues of air accidents. One was already explaining that it was impossible to have a terrorist attack, or at least that the attack was not compatible with the data we knew. That is to say, a plane that for several minutes will continue to fly straight, and then will emit information like there is smoke, there are electrical problems, etc. Despite the hypothesis being incompatible with the available information about the device, this scenario starts to gain traction in public opinion, largely due to Egypt's insistence on claiming there was a terrorist attack on board the plane. In any case, the searches begin, so the national navies of France, obviously of Italy, which is also in the area, and of Egypt, will do what is necessary to try to find debris and to find the black boxes. And the very next day, May 20th, we start to have debris that are recovered by the Egyptian Navy, which allows us to narrow down the search area. On May 23rd, the Aviation Ensign Jacobet, a specialist in underwater SAW combat, will detect the pings emitted by the black boxes. And on May 24th, there are direct forensic analyses that confirm there was an explosion on board based on the analysis of the bodies that were recovered. So here we are really on a total misunderstanding. How can an explosion simply cause smoke and a fire in the cockpit? It's something that is incomprehensible, obviously. A week after the crash, we also learned that the Committee on Space Research search and rescue satellite-aided tracking beacons, which are the ones that are supposed to trigger when an impact is emitted, and this signal is sent at 2:36 and 59 seconds, that is, at the moment of touching the water and not in flight, at the moment when there could have been an explosion and a disintegration of the aircraft in flight. 3 days later, we have the oceanographic research ship, the Laplace, arriving on the scene and further improving the accuracy of the wreck's locations until the underwater robot rented by Egypt retrieves the black boxes on June 16th at 4,000 meters deep, which was out of reach for the ship that had been dispatched until then. On June 29th, Egypt releases the first elements that are drawn from the analysis of the black boxes, and they will confirm that there was indeed smoke detected on board, which confirms the information that was obtained from the messages at CARS. They also say that the crew spoke of a fire. So once again, we are really on this theory of the fire, and we think that Egypt is really going to conduct an investigation in which it will reveal the true situation, and the question we then ask ourselves is, what can trigger a fire in the cockpit? Except that a few days later, Egypt will start again. It will even say this time that there are traces of explosives that have been detected on debris and on bodies, and it will invite France, the gendarmes of the Institut de Recherche Criminelle de la Gendarmerie Nationale, who are usually part of this investigation. They will be invited to go check that there is indeed trinitrotoluene available. So they go, they do the investigations, they indeed see that there is trinitrotoluene, and they say, then one reveal a little secret to you. At the time, one was working at the crisis management center called Centre Opérationnel de Gestion 1 Interministériel des Crises, which is at the civil security, which is Place Beauvau. That is to say, among my colleagues, one had professional and civilian firefighters, military civil security formations, deminers who are police officers, the high mountain gendarmes, and among all these beautiful people, so these are friends of friends who are part of the one Institut de Recherche Criminelle de la Gendarmerie Nationale who were on site. And these people, they say, we indeed detected trinitrotoluene, but the concentration was such that it could not have been in the water in the past. It's that these debris, they were polluted afterwards. And so what they want is, okay, we found trinitrotoluene, but let us conduct an investigation to find out where this trinitrotoluene came from. The Egyptians forbid them from doing these additional analyses. France refuses to countersign that it had found trinitrotoluene on these debris. If there is trinitrotoluene on the debris, there are three options. Either we are really dealing with a case of an attack, and so obviously there would be some. Another possibility is that this pollution is accidental. For example, by handling the debris on the ship's deck by the military, or following an exercise, like for instance was the case for the crash of Trans World Airlines Flight 800 in the United States of America in 1996, for which there were indeed traces of explosives that were found on the debris, but which actually corresponded to an exercise that had taken place a few weeks earlier, in which traces were placed for an exercise with dogs and for detection. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an explosive, if there are really traces of explosives behind. And obviously the third possibility would be that Egypt simply smeared the debris with traces of explosives so that the French could confirm their initial hypothesis, and that the French did not want to confirm. So, in December 2016, we're wasting time. Egypt is still insisting, and this time it announces that it has found traces of explosives on some bodies, which were fished out. France sends specialists to the site once again, and there, on the other hand, they are going to be clear. They do not find these traces of trinitrotoluene that are once again mentioned. French investigators have been present in Egypt since the beginning. One remind you, in the investigation, they were present at the beginning. And when we pick up pieces from the beginning, they also do analyses and surveys, and they hadn't found anything until then. And the problem is that at that point, Egypt does not close its technical investigation. It is still ongoing, it is no longer progressing, but technically they are still in charge, and since they do not close it, No country can take over the investigation, and France cannot say, well, we will take over the investigation to be able to finish it. Egypt is intentionally delaying and not fulfilling its duties, like releasing an initial technical report a month following the crash. There are obligations that are not being respected. France cannot conduct this investigation independently. The official investigation is carried out by a country, and it's the country. It was Egyptian maritime territory. It was a plane registered in Egypt, and even if it's a plane of French origin, an Airbus, if it departed from Paris with French victims, we cannot take the lead on this investigation, unfortunately. And so we have to endure the investigation as it is carried out by the Egyptians. So, in July 2018, we still lost more than 2 years. The Bureau of Economic Analysis publishes a press release in which it reveals their conclusion, and it repeats that it's a fire that broke out in the cockpit, that the fire developed rapidly until causing the loss of control of the plane, and the investigation office analyzes 2 hypotheses about the fire that could have caused this accident. The first is that there would be a short circuit, a technical problem, even if obviously it's always unlikely to have technical problems on these devices. They still mention this hypothesis. And the second possibility would be an external source of fire, such as a mobile phone or a tablet that would have caught fire in the cockpit, or directly a cigarette, since he recalls that in 2016 it was still not forbidden in the cockpits of the Egyptian companies to be able to smoke, and for the anecdote, it was still allowed until 2019 in China to be able to smoke on board. It's the last country which obviously banned it, the cigarette in the cockpits, and so much the better. In any case, the fire would have been accelerated by the release of oxygen that was in the cylinders, which are under the masks that are available in the cockpit, oxygen masks, since there is a characteristic noise of an oxygen leak that was identified in the analysis of the sound black boxes that we call the cockpit voice recorder. And so we clearly see a scenario that is being put in place and which is technically credible and compatible with the data we have. And there are 2 options for the accidental release of oxygen. The first is that the co-pilot's mask could have been inadvertently set to emergency mode, because you should know that oxygen masks are either a mixture of air and oxygen, to increase the oxygen level in what they are going to breathe, and either it's pure oxygen or we are in normal mode, and so it's when we inhale that it's going to provide this mixture a bit like we have in scuba diving, or it's going to release it continuously with a flow that can therefore be 100% oxygen if we are in emergency mode. So if the rotator is positioned on position, the emergency position, then the mask will release 100% oxygen. No need to illustrate the scenario of having 100% oxygen entering a cockpit while smoking a cigarette. Obviously, there's a chance that it could start a fire. And the BA publishes a study on cockpit fires in December. In 2023, it is proven that the noise heard in the cockpit is indeed an oxygen leak, mentioning several previous accidents. In 2008, a Boeing 767 cargo plane caught fire on the ground in San Francisco due to a short circuit, which would have ignited the flexible of the oxygen mask, leading to a fire, which will destroy the cockpit and even totally destroy the roof of the aircraft also. In 2011, there is a Boeing 777-200 from the company EGYPTAIR, again, who suffers a similar incident while it is on the ground too. It will cause a fire in the cockpit until piercing the wall of the plane, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis will therefore carry out a series of tests, videos that are filmed, that are shared on their YouTube channel, in which they will validate or affirm several hypotheses. The fire of a phone or a tablet in different places in the cockpit. They will also check the consequence of a cigarette that would fall into the mask storage box. And obviously we see that if the oxygen is then being released, it triggers a fire. He also checks the effect of using a halon fire extinguisher on the oxygen fire, since this request to use a fire extinguisher is heard in the sound black box. And finally, there are propagation tests in which the influx of oxygen is ensured by the oxygen mask in emergency mode. And we see how quickly the fire spreads and resumes despite the use of the halon fire extinguisher. And you see here the consequences once they have extinguished the fire and they have turned the lights back on. So the Bureau of Economic Analysis specifies once again that they do not know determine if it was the fire that caused the oxygen leak, for example by puncturing the mask hose, or if there was a leak that was related to a malfunction or poor handling of the mask, since this leak would then have met a flame. On this they cannot decide. There is also more detail on the content of the cockpit voice recorder, that is to say this sound black box with a description of the sounds that are recorded in the cockpit at 2:25 and 29 seconds. There is a noise that goes pop, then a whistle that corresponds to the oxygen leak. And a second later, there is a fire alarm, fire announcements by the crew members. And 5 seconds later, he asks for the extinguisher quickly, and as expected, there is obviously not the slightest sound of explosion that is mentioned in the cockpit voice recorder analysis. However, we learn that there is a musical atmosphere in the cockpit during the flight from the beginning to the end. And the hypothesis of the cigarette is also put forward, since there are several sentences from the pilot and co-pilot which are translated from Arabic by the phrase "blow your smoke on me," and a little later the captain asks the co-pilot, "Have you stopped smoking? One can no longer smell the smoke." So we suspect that there was a cigarette on board, but the Egyptians, they will say that it was badly translated, and they, on their side, they say that this phrase, "blow your smoke on me," it can also be translated as he had a discomfort talking about a passenger who was sick, so it's not exactly the same meaning. But then the report also says that there can be no formal evidence that there was a lit cigarette in the cockpit, even if, of course, it's quite credible given the exchanges we could hear. But we are still waiting for this final report accident of 2016, and Egypt will provide it on October 30th. 2024, just a few weeks ago, and the report does mention an oxygen leak and a fire in the cockpit, but against all odds, it continues once again to repeat that there would have been an explosion on board and that this explosion would have occurred in a trolley, which was located just behind the cockpit. And they say this based simply on the deformations that a trolley undergoes, but when you read the report, there are a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of things that are false or things that have been contradicted. He reiterates that French analyses found trinitrotoluene traces on the bodies. And on debris, while it can't be proven for the debris, and the French found nothing on the bodies, they don't give a detailed description of the sequence of events. The explosion, is it what triggered the leak? Or the explosion is what ignited the oxygen leak, and yet they don't even talk about the noise of the explosion. While in all previous investigations in which you had a bombing on board, you always have a noise of explosion that is systematically heard. For example, if you look at the investigation report of MH17, the plane that was shot down by the Russians over Ukraine in 2014, we even managed to have a location of the explosion outside the cockpit, simply by looking at the timing of the arrival of the explosion noise on the different microphones that are present in the cockpit. And there, for the Egyptian flight, they claim that there is an explosion, but that there is no explosion noise. So admit that it is not simply an inconsistency, it is simply not possible. But the craziest thing is when we get to the annexes of the report, because France provided a response to this report which is objectively false. And the Egyptians stuck it on page 642 of the report on a document that is still 663 pages, and this annex is not even mentioned in the table of contents, so that someone who is going to look will never find this document. You really have to read it page by page to accidentally come across the contradictions issued by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And we learn, for example, that last July, the Bureau of Economic Analysis provided comments, and that these comments were simply not taken into account, and they say it very clearly. The Egyptian report is oriented to be able to make sure that the reader accepts this theory of the explosion that there was on board. As an example, the Egyptian report does mention the debris on which traces of combustion have been identified, but they only mention the debris that is in the cabin, and they forget those that are in the cockpit, where there was obviously the fire. They also recall that Egypt refused the offer to carry out additional analyses to determine the origin of the trinitrotoluene. The Egyptians also forget to detail the progressive loss of microphones, which is linked to the progression of the fire in the cockpit, because once again, this would be evidence and elements that support the theory of the fire taking precedence over the explosion. And he therefore reminds us that the hypothesis favored by the Bureau of Economic Analysis is, one quote, that a fire broke out in the cockpit while the plane was at its cruising altitude, a fire which developed rapidly and led to the loss of control of the plane. So we have a final report that is absurd, implausible, which is totally unsatisfactory for all those who will read it, which is against France, and in which we see a disagreement between the parties involved. This was the first time one encountered something like this, so one wondered if it was unprecedented or if there had been previous investigations where stakeholders reached completely different conclusions. In fact, one found two precedents. The first was the flight of the Egyptian crash 990, which took place in 1999 off the American coast. According to American investigations, it would simply be linked to a pilot's suicide, and while the Egyptian investigators, they do not rule out the mechanical cause to obviously attack Boeing. The second case one found was a crash of the Boeing 737 of Flash Airlines off the coast of Sharm el-Sheikh in 2004. Flash Airlines, which is an Egyptian company in which the investigators of the National Transportation Safety Board and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, so the American National Transportation Safety Board and the French Bureau of Economic Analysis, concluded to a spatial disorientation of the captain who led the plane to crash, while the Egyptian authorities still support today the hypothesis of a technical failure, which they have still not managed to explain. And so, the third case in the world is this flight MS-804 of the company EGYPTAIR 1. Do not know if you manage to find a sort of common point between these EGYPTAIR flights, Egyptian Flash Airlines, and again Egyptians, but in any case it is a country that refuses the reality of technical analyses, which can be seen everywhere in the world. They have lost all credibility, but in any case, it is good that the Bureau of Economic Analysis was able to put this letter, and that this letter was integrated in the final report, and one put all the links so that you can go see the different stages. It's almost a soap opera that dates back now for 8 years. It's a shame to have taken so much time just trying to cross reality. One hope you enjoyed this video, this channel at the beginning. You remember that it was launched mainly for civil aviation and air safety and accident analysis. Fortunately, there are fewer and fewer accidents, so we have less and less opportunity to talk about it. But occasionally like this, we will continue to do civil aviation because it's still the passion that is present. One hope you liked it, and one will see you very soon.